Christmas Carol. Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Here we go. Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadliest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will, therefore, permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew that he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I was started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of this story. I am going to relate to you. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Say, St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterward, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people, new to the business, called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire, secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his lips thin blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosting rime was on his head and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about him. His iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather could chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of an advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Now, for fun, I think that we should skip ahead to some of the fun parts. What do you think? Here we go. We have the entrance of his nephew. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that was his intimidation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come, then," returned his nephew gainly, "what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better ready answer at the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it with a humbug. Now, let's skip ahead to the good part. Do you want to skip to some ghosties? Now, it is a fact that there was nothing particular about the knocker on his door, except that it was very large. It also is a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence of the place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of him 7 years past. And then let any man explain to me, he can now, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked up at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if breath or hot air, though the eyes were wide open. They were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. Now, let us see what Scrooge sees at night. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its dead, cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound its head and chin, which it wrapped. He had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessary of embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe me," said the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more gravy than grave about you." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any mean waggishing them. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. To sit staring at those fixed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but there was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly still and motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only a second, to divert his vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," said the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said Marley, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, and all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself falling into a swoon. But now much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head as if it was too warm to wear indoors, the lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said, "dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of my worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," Scrooge said, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear a chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron and cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebeneezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me! In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets, pondering on what the ghost had said. He did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed in a very business-like manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow?" the ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and travelling that whole time? "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive, bound and double ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know the ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is at all developed, not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for the vast means of its usefulness, not to know that no space of regret can make amends to one's life opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now begun to apply himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, the benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all of its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through the crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to the poor abode, where no poor houses to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and he began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," the ghost said. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard on me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many, many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped precipitation from his brow. "There is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance, a hope of escaping my fate, a chance, a hope of procuring Ebeneezer. You are always a good friend to me, Scrooge. Thank ye." "You will be haunted," said the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without these visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Cease to vibrate, look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us."